You're listening to the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley. We're so glad that you've joined us once again today as we talk about matters of life, family, and ministry.
Yeah, it's great to be back with everyone again. And today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic to do with the church, the global church, and leadership.
Yeah, and I think it's something that's always in our discussion here around home about church and how it's going and what it should look like and how it should function. And of course, like anybody who goes to church, we have our criticisms and we have our praises and different things. But I do think this is a biblical model for what church should look like that we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, it's something that comes up a lot in our topics of discussion because when you're studying the Bible, you start to see there's a little bit of a discrepancy between how church was operating in the New Testament times, the apostolic era, and the way that it operates today in a large majority of the Western world.
Yeah, and that's not to say that the way that we do it now is a bad way or the best way or any of that. It's just to say it is different. I mean, culturally and history-wise, things have changed and things have become different in the way the church runs and the way the church functions. But there are elements that I think we need to get back to that were really valuable and just really the basis for why the early church thrived and why it did so well.
Yeah. One of the things that sort of strikes me is that wherever you go, so we've done a little bit of traveling around the world, and wherever you go, church is kind of done differently. And there's a very large cultural element to the way churches operate and function.
Definitely so. I mean, the way a little village church in Africa looks, it looks very different to the high Roman Catholic Church in Venice, when we go to Europe. And of course, in America, we have mega churches and little churches and all that. And here in Australia, very similar, where churches just all kind of function culturally in a lot of ways with wherever they're located.
Yeah, my first experience of that was really, I grew up in a little country town in Australia, going to a Church of Christ, and it was a small Church of Christ. I don't know how many people were there, maybe 100. And we were blessed in that it was a wide range of ages. It wasn't just elderly people, which a lot of those little country town churches can be. And there were families, young families and that sort of thing, which is why my parents took us there. And it was really just like a family. We did life together. We ate meals together. We had a great time together. But it was pretty conservative and pretty low key. There was, I remember it being a big deal when people raised their hands or clapped, and then we brought in the vineyard music instead of just hymns. That was a pretty big deal. Some people didn't really like it. And so that was my experience of church growing up. When I was 8, we went to the Solomon Islands for 2 months. My aunt and uncle were missionaries over there and my grandmother. And we went and stayed with them and visited and got to see the Solomon Islands. And wow, church over there was really different to what we were used to. I vaguely remember attending a church, and it was really just a roof with some wooden pylons holding it up, and a bunch of people stood under there and just sang to the high heavens with, there were no instruments or anything, I don't think, and they just sang, and their voices were so beautiful, and it was all these harmonies together, and they were really loud and clapping and celebrating, and it was great. I loved it.
Yeah. Well, my childhood experience going to church was about as different to yours as it possibly could be. I grew up in Atlanta, and of course we went to what they call a mega church, and there would be 2,000 or 3,000 people there on a Sunday for a service, and just very large facility, large auditorium, large building. Everything we did was large and big, but it was very, very organized and very prim and proper. And back in those days, you wore a suit and tie to church, even as a kid. And all of that. So
I was disappointed that I was made to wear shoes to church. So.
Yeah. So my experience couldn't be more different than yours growing up. And now the church we go to would be considered one of the larger churches in Brisbane, not probably your standard Australian church. I think most Australian churches are somewhere between 50 and 100 people is probably like the average size, whereas we're more in that 5,000 range with 1,000 people on a Sunday, that kind of thing. So we're still kind of in a big church. It's big for Australia anyway.
Yeah, for sure it is. But it's got a somewhat different culture again. So I think wherever you go, the culture changes, and that's where you see slight variations in how worship is run or how services are run and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and our discussion today is not about worship style. Do you have a choir and a pipe organ? Do you have a full band? Do you have, a person at the front with a guitar? Because that all is dependent on the resources of the church and the capability of the church and all that. And even a style of preaching. We're not talking. We're not talking about that. Actually, I feel like we're really talking more about how we relate to one another. It's more about those relationships than how the processes and protocols and the setup of the church is. It's not about all that, because I don't think that there's a one best or right way. I think, as you say, depending on where you're at, we can all come together and worship God and grow together. And that was really the point of the early church was, it said they didn't forsake the gathering of themselves. It meant they put importance and a priority on being together. Why? So that they could grow together, so they could worship together, so that they had a space where there were other like-minded people, that were believers. And if you were new, it was a place to grow. And if you were more mature, it was a place to mentor or encourage or build up those that were younger or less mature in the faith. And I think, unfortunately, today, because particularly in the Western church, we have so many resources. We have so much money. We have so much just energy and people and all this sort of stuff that it's very easy to get distracted by the lights and the sound and all this kind of stuff and forget, why are we actually gathering together?
I mean, there's a lot of churches that it's almost like it's a show that's put on each Sunday or whenever they have a meeting, and there's people who sit and watch the show.
Yeah. I know for me, churches, and I say this a lot, like church, we have a wonderful church. We love our church, have some brilliant people who lead it and just do a fantastic job. The sermons are great. The music is great. But I always say, if I want to hear really, really great music, I'll go to a concert, because those professional musicians are put on a better show. Like, if that's why I'm going, there's not really point in going on a Sunday. If I want to hear somebody who's a dynamic speaker, I've got YouTube, and I can go to a conference, or I can go places and find the best speakers in the world.
I think a lot of people are doing that.
Yeah. But the reason that I continue to go to my local church is for the relationships and the people that are there.
If we follow the Bible and what Paul and others in the early church said, they encourage people to love one another, to make disciples, and to be a family, essentially. I was going to read something that Jesus said, and I thought this was really an interesting perspective. He said in Matthew 12:48-50, he replied to him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." And he was referring to them, saying your mother and your brothers are outside. And he's saying, my family is here, because whoever does my will, whoever is one of my followers, they are my family. And that's kind of how the early church operated. If you look throughout the narrative of the gospel messages and all of Paul's letters and the other letters, they refer to each other as brother and sister, mother and father. We're a family, we love one another. We provide each other's needs. We help each other out. We're there for each other. And Paul really emphasized church unity as part of that.
Yeah, and to finish what I was saying, because it sounds like I just go to church for the relationships, and I think it's more than a social club, because I have other outlets in my life that I have great relationships in, and that's not the single reason I go, but it is to be in a place with other believers. That is important, that there are other believers there, yes. But it's also to be in a place where God's Spirit is, to grow in Him, to worship Him. And I think it's really important. People all the time say, I can worship God and know God and whatever and do it on my own. I don't have to go to church.
Yeah.
Well, that's true to a degree. Yes, you can. If you got stranded on a desert island all by yourself, God would still be there and you could still interact with Him and still worship Him. But there is value in being in a community of other believers, just as you say, that we meet each other's needs. We talk a lot about loving one another. We've done a couple of podcasts on that. but it's really, really important that we're with other people. God has made us for relationship. He created us to have relationship.
Yeah, and I mean, I really believe, and this is throughout the Bible as well, that our faith is strengthened by one another and by being together and praying together and sharing things with one another. You can't maintain a really strong faith and intimacy with God unless you are surrounded by other believers who are helping you through those difficult times or helping you understand difficult passages in the Bible. Or, you say iron sharpens iron. Well, it does. We need each other for that.
And, there have been times, even in the recent couple of weeks, there was a Sunday I went to church and I was just feeling really low, and I've been kind of arguing with God about different things. I just wasn't feeling real close to him, but I came into the sanctuary and the worship was going, and sometimes God kind of sets us up for this stuff. And every song was about, like, all the lyrics of each song that we sung that day was about, I'm going to worship you when the times are hard. I'm going to worship you when it's good. Like, I don't know. There were 5 songs in a row, which basically said the same sort of thing about, God, you're good. I believe you're good. Even when it's not good, I believe you're, and I had to, for me, what helped me in that time, like, I had to actually sing those words, and I sang some of those words with tears running down my face because I wasn't feeling it, but I forced myself to do it. But part of that, I was in an environment with a whole bunch of other people who were not feeling the same way I was, and they could sing those things with joy.
Yeah.
I was singing it in sorrow, but by doing that, it gave me encouragement, and it lifted my spirit. And it was almost an act of discipline to go, okay, I'm going to worship you, God, even though I'm kind of grumpy with you right now.
Yeah.
I'm going to still worship you.
It's the sacrifice of praise we talk about.
But it made all the difference.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would have done that by myself.
Yeah, probably not.
It was because I was in an environment with other believers who were singing it sincerely from their heart that got me going, no, you're right. I need I need to turn my heart. I need to change my heart.
Yeah.
But you couldn't do that, as I say, on your own. I guess there's some disciplined person somewhere. I'm not that person. But it was so important to be with other people and other believers.
So when we're discussing leadership in the church, one of the things that really sort of stands out to me when I read through the New Testament and read through about the churches, the early church, there were no pastors back then. Today, we have every church is headed up by a pastor or multiple pastors, and everyone talks about pastors and who can be a pastor and pastors in leadership, and you have pastoral leadership conferences and all sorts of things. But in the early church, there were no pastors. And
there were probably people serving in that role, but definitely the definition of pastor is very different now. The
actual term pastor, nobody had that role in a church in a leadership position. What we see in the New Testament were elders or overseers were the ones who were sort of heading up churches and it wasn't like now, because it was very much servant leaders. And what we saw were home churches. They were mostly home churches because they were kicked out of the synagogues. They weren't allowed to preach there because they were considered a sect or a cult. And they had nowhere to worship, so they were worshipping in their homes, and they had overseers who oversaw the home churches, and they weren't pastors in the sense of maybe they weren't standing up and preaching from a pulpit with, slapping the pulpit with their hand as they shouted things. I'm being a bit facetious because that's more of a preacher. I know that that's not really what a pastor is, but that's not who ran the churches. They were not. The leaders were what were called overseers. And I'll just read what the Bible says about what an overseer is. In Titus 1, it says, "Appoint elders in every town as I directed you. An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it." So what we see there is really a picture of someone who has integrity, who is upstanding, and who is blameless and has their own family and life in order and is able to sort of guide the church and in the direction that they should go.
Yeah, they're a mature believer. They understood what the message was. They understood how to behave and how to act. They were able to model that and to bring others along with them. And the early church, as we say, they wouldn't have showed up and sang some songs and then had somebody come up and preach because there was no Bible to preach. I think a lot of the learning and the growing was just by being together. And a lot of what they did actually was pray. They prayed and they worshiped.
And we see Paul talking about bringing a prophetic word. So if you have a prophetic word, you stand up and take turns giving those words. And that sort of thing was more than like preaching a message from the Bible, because there wasn't a Bible. They might have read parts of letters that they received from disciples and that sort of thing, but they were speaking in tongues, they were giving prophetic words, they were praying and worshiping together, they were fellowshipping together. They probably had, vibrant discussions about things.
Yeah. I mean, the only sort of preaching that you see is when they go out to evangelize.
Yeah.
I mean, the preaching happened on the streets and in other places where they were sharing the gospel, but those that were believers were coming together to pray and to do those sorts of things.
And they were bringing in new believers all the time, so obviously they had to teach them. And what we see is discipleship. So it was a discipleship model where they would come alongside people and they would teach them. Now, what I read out from Titus, it uses gendered language. It's talking about he and man and all this sort of stuff. But we know that there were overseers in that early church who were women. We've got Priscilla and Nympha and different women that were also overseers. So we know that they're just referring to someone who is of good moral character, upstanding, has their life in order and can help direct the church. And kind of what we've got now is we've got these CEO kind of pastors who are charismatic and good preachers, and people, admire them and look up to them and that sort of thing. And maybe they're really gifted in evangelism, or maybe they're really gifted at speaking, but they might not have that character and that moral fortitude to be the overseer that's sort of leading the church forward. And Paul doesn't say anything in his description of an overseer about the person being really good at praying or really good at healing or, charismatic or a good speaker or has baptized this many people. He doesn't have any of those criteria. What he's saying is he just wants someone that's got really good character and is going to be upstanding. And we're going to be talking more about that in next week's podcast.
Yeah. Well, pastors today tend to follow a bit of a CEO model. Like there's kind of this executive business model that many churches have taken on, especially churches that are larger. And I understand why. Some of that is to maintain the organization. You need a hierarchy and you need steps in place to make sure everything happens and everyone's cared for and all of that. But even in smaller churches, we still, even if there's a church and they just have the pastor, the one guy, and he preaches on Sunday and maybe he's even part-time, we still look to this one person for the leadership of church. Whereas I feel like it was much more of a community model in the early church. Yes, there were elders, there were people who were leading, and you need somebody like that to be able to call out what's wrong or what's right, or to organize people together. And you get more than about 5 people together and you're going to be going in 5 different directions. And so it takes someone who is respected and wise to sort of guide a group and to bring them to the right place.
Yeah. And I think we've lost a little bit of that because, as I say, a lot of the leaders, especially in places like the United States and so on, but also in Australia, a lot of the church leaders are pastors who are very just charismatic people, when I say people, I mean people love them, people flock to them, they are good with people. Maybe they're really compassionate and they are good at preaching and things like that. And that's not really the criteria for good leaders in the church. And the other thing that I would say also is, as I mentioned, the model that Jesus provided us and the model that Paul provided us were about servant leadership and not putting ourselves forward, not pushing ourselves up.
Yeah, well, that would be what the pastor in the traditional sense was like. They were somebody who served. They were somebody who cared for people. They weren't necessarily a leader. They weren't necessarily organizing things and making the plans and setting the vision and all of that, but they were somebody who cared for people.
Yeah. And I think the people who are gifted, highly gifted, charismatic, good teachers, all that sort of stuff, it's so wonderful that they can use those giftings for the benefit of the church, but they need elders of good moral character, maybe with more mature faith, to guide and teach and lead them in the right direction and correct them when they go in the wrong direction. There's a couple of verses in Matthew that's interesting. In Matthew 23, Jesus is speaking to the crowds and his disciples, and he criticizes the religious leaders of the time, the Pharisees and so on. He says, "Don't let anyone call you rabbi, for you have only one teacher, and all of you are equal as brothers and sisters. And don't address anyone here on earth as Father, for only God in heaven is your Father. And don't let anyone call you teacher, for you have only one teacher, the Messiah. The greatest among you must be a servant, but those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You won't go in yourselves, and you don't let others enter either."
Yeah, well, I mean, that highlights when we get too involved with the hierarchy, that this one person or this set of people, they're the leaders, they do everything, they're the gifted ones, they're the ones who God has anointed and called. We get into trouble there because then we lose, I guess, the responsibility of that community. You know, you and I, we're not the youngest people in the church, but we're not the oldest either. And we have a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom. God has made us go through lots of things so we can relate and speak into people's lives. And it's really important that we do that. Like in our church, the pastor cannot be personable. He can't know every single person, you know, intimately and be able to speak into their life on a personal level. He can from the front, you know, on a Sunday and preaching, but it's really the relationships of the congregation among each other. That's where people really get transformed. People get touched, people grow, they cry together, they laugh together, they share joys, they share sorrows. And I think if we get too involved with a hierarchy that's the pastor, he does the work, and I'm here to, if he asks me to do something, I'll help.
Yeah,
if we get into that, we lose an opportunity because God has gifted each and every one of us. You know, we've talked about spiritual gifts. He's given every believer spiritual gifts. Why? So that we can serve one another for the greater good. It's not, only the leadership, only the staff at a church have spiritual gifts and they're the only one operating in them. We should all be doing that. And I think the church misses out if there's this hierarchy that's so rigid and straight that no one can pray for anybody except for the pastor. And that's what we see. I mean, it becomes a little bit of a criticism of the Catholic Church, but that's where that's become a problem, where you can't, as a Catholic, you're not really supposed to pray yourself. You go to a priest to have them pray for you.
Yeah, I mean, I will criticize the Catholic Church a little bit and just say, you know, Jesus was the final priest. I mean, we don't need any more priests. And in the New Testament, we are called the royal priesthood because Jesus was the final priest. And that passage that I read, it said, don't call anyone else rabbi or father because Jesus is the one, the only one that we should use that name for. What I would like to just sort of bring it all back to is that over and over and over, we keep seeing the same idea of the church being a family of brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, and that we're to love one another and be there for one another and support and encourage and uplift one another with the gifts that we've been given. And it's not a CEO, it's not a boss employee, it's not a show where we sit in the pews and watch something that's been prepared for us. We're a family of believers and we're all in it together as equals.
Well, I think we just really need to remember when we come to church on Sunday, there's something that we bring that we should be giving to others, and they're bringing something that we can receive from them. And I think we just need to change our attitude and our perspective about what church looks like. We're not going to change how churches operate at this point. It's too set in stone. It's what it is. But I think as believers, if we come on a Sunday, not just going, I hope he preaches a really good sermon, I hope they play that worship song I really like, If we come as consumers, that's going to be the end of it. Like, that's all you're going to get.
We change the church by changing ourselves.
That's it. And if you're only coming to receive, to get something out of it, and there's nothing wrong. Look, if you're in a place where you're empty, okay, you're dry, you do need to come to receive. But when you're not in that place, you need to come to give. And whether that means volunteering in some role, or if it just means being open to have a conversation over a cup of coffee, then I think our perspective on church needs to change, and to start to see, you know what, God's gifted me, God's blessed me. Just because the word pastor or the title pastor is not in front of my name, I still have something of value to contribute within my congregation. God's placed me here for a reason. And so if we come with that in mind, God's going to use us. People will be blessed. And at the same time, we'll be blessed, because if everyone's doing this, it becomes reciprocal and everyone gets blessed.
Yeah. When we put pastors on a pedestal and we lift them up and say they are in charge, they're in authority, they're leading the way, and we don't have this more collaborative community approach, when they fall, which they do because we're all human, it has such catastrophic impact on the entire church. And we'll talk more about that next week. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up, just so that it leads into next week's discussion, is that this model that we have in place, it leads to those kinds of issues. And I do think it's possible to change the church, because I've heard a lot of people having this same discussion that, the way that we have structured church so that it's so hierarchical and so based upon the show and the charisma of the leader, it's caused a lot of problems. It's caused a lot of pain in the church. It's caused a lot of issues.
It does make you vulnerable to issues, yes, arising, particularly if those in power don't have accountability. And that's what we see a lot in churches, particularly when you read about a famous pastor or whatever get into trouble and fall. It's usually because they don't have accountability. They've gotten so high up that nobody feels able to speak into their life and say, to use an Australian phrase, mate, pull your head in.
Exactly.
And
I think that we do need to change as a church. I think that the global church needs a change. It needs to go back to the way that the early church was structured, which is one of a family of believers coming together in love and unity, and not worrying about leadership. I mean, they have leadership conferences for pastors and things, and leadership seminars and how to lead and all this sort of stuff. And you've been involved in things like that. And it's not about the servant leader anymore. It's not about, serving and washing the feet of your congregation like Jesus did with his disciples, and putting, the message that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and that God uses the weak to confound the strong and all that sort of stuff. That's the message of the gospel. And we've kind of lost sight of that by putting leaders onto pedestals and making them the boss and in charge. And then it's causing a lot of pain and difficulty throughout the church, but it's also causing a lot of apathy among believers who feel unempowered to really be a full contributing member of their congregation.
Well, that's why I say I think we need to change our perspective about why we go to church. I don't know that we necessarily need to change what it looks like on a Sunday. Sure, there's things we could tweak or apply that's different, but I do think the basic normal believer who comes to church needs to come with a different attitude and a different perspective of why they're joining together. Why have you taken up one of your 2 days off during the week, half that day, to show up at this building? Why? Like I say this a lot. Unless I'm going there to meet with God and to meet with people and have meaningful relationships and interactions, I would rather be fishing. I would rather be playing golf or doing whatever it may be. That I could better spend my time if I'm just going to hear a message and sing some songs and maybe have a cup of coffee and then go home. It's kind of a waste. And I know that sounds a bit negative and pessimistic, but really, when we come together, there should be a purpose and there should be intent on, God, how can you use me today? How can I encourage a person? How can I speak into their life? Is there someone you want me to listen to? Is there someone that needs to speak into my life? If we start doing that, I think it changes kind of from the inside out. Instead of trying to tear down the church and build it from the bottom, I think you do it from the inside out. And you do it as believers coming together in love for one another, seeking what God has for us, and this is a way to live day by day. It's not just on a Sunday. We need to wake up every morning going, God, how can you use me? Where do you want me to speak into people's lives? Is it in my workplace? Is it in my family? Is it at school? Is it in the coffee date that I have later with my girlfriend? Whatever it may be, God, when do you want to use me? How do you want to use me? I often talk about that with Jesus. He always said he only did what the Father, showed him to do or told him to do. But the Bible also says before it was light, he would go away and spend time in prayer with God. I think he would go away and go, God, who do you want me to heal today? And I really believe God would show him there's going to be a leper on the side of the road today. When you see him, you're to heal him. Or there's going to be a blind person. When you see them, spit in their eyes and they're going to be healed. I really feel like God had already sort of pre-planned a lot of his ministry. Okay, this is extra biblical. This is my opinion. But I really feel like it was in those times that Jesus spent with God that he prepared him for the day. What do you want me to speak on today, God? Okay.
And that's how we should all go to church. And I think we need to stop putting leaders on pedestals. We need to stop giving them all the authority and all the power in our lives and in our faith. We need to turn our eyes to Jesus as the one who really guides and directs us.
Well, he is the head of the church. Jesus is the head. We are all just body parts after that. Regardless of what your title or position is, we're all just body parts after Christ. I think as we come together and we worship together, if we come with that new intent, with that new attitude, I think things do change. If we see each other as family, now I know family can be a charged word for some people. Some people have horrible families and horrible family experiences and all of that. But if you can get past your triggers and look at what a family's supposed to be and how it's supposed to function, if you come thinking a family, there's a little bit of hierarchy in a family. Mom and dad are kind of in charge. But at the same time, once children and family members are adults, it's very peer-to-peer. You lose...
Yeah, the parents will still share their wisdom and say, I think you're going down the wrong direction here. Maybe you should course correct, that sort of thing. My parents do that. They speak into our lives still. They're not bossing us around and telling us what to do because we're mature adults.
Yeah. And I so value input from someone who's older than me and more experienced or wiser than me. They don't even have to be older. If they're just more experienced, I know nothing about working on a car, but if there was an 18-year-old kid who's a brilliant mechanic, I probably will take his advice.
Yeah.
Because he knows better than I do. And I think it's taking advantage of those opportunities within our community of believers, wherever that may be, that when we do that, we all grow, we're all blessed, we feel valuable. If someone asks my advice and I give them advice and they go away and apply it and come back, man, that was really good advice. Okay, well, their problem was solved and I feel good. I feel like, oh, I'm so glad I could help you. And we're both blessed by that.
Yeah.
Well, as always, it seems like we've come back to loving one another. It's just such a theme of our podcast and our life. But we just want to encourage you as you go to your church this weekend, go with a different attitude. Go looking for how God can use you. Where can you give? Where can you receive? And be that iron that sharpens iron. This has been the Kingfisher Podcast with Eric and Bron Whitley. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a brilliant day.